right, so here we are, week 6. It's the final week that we're going to be talking about David the Great. Now, we've gone from when David was a little boy as a shepherd out in the field until all the way last week where he was anointed to become king. And I'm going to dig a little bit more into that in just a few minutes. But before I get there, I want to tell a story of my time back in college. I was in a ministry group when I was at Lee. And we would travel all over the country. We actually traveled all over the world. We went to Israel when I was there. In 1999, we went to Israel, and it was a trip that I'll never forget. But we would travel and minister in different churches during spring break and fall break and summer and every opportunity we got. And we were known for being very Pentecostal, charismatic, exuberant in our worship. There's a youth conference that takes place in the spring called Winterfest. And in Winterfest, they have this stage, and we sing this song called More Abundantly, but it was this part of this song where it's joy, 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 and everybody's singing joy, and you get to bouncing. And once you get to bouncing, I mean, we've broken risers before, but this particular time at Winterfest, we're jumping and bouncing, and we could feel the entire temporary stage begin to flex. We had broken the supports underneath the stage, and it was just, joy, joy. You got 100 people doing this, and some of them even bigger than me, and they just broke the stage. So that was just, we were known for doing that kind of thing, for being exuberant in our worship. So one memorable moment, I have a picture of it from 1998, from Lee Day, 1998. Now, what Lee Day was it was a day that happened once a year where people would come on campus. It happened during the spring, and prospective students would come and tour the campus. They would maybe sit in on classes and see if this was a school that they wanted to go to. We had this music explosion type deal that would happen on usually Friday night, and it was in the auditorium that would seat about 2,000 people, and we would pack everyone in there, and each group would get to do their featured number, their one song that they were known for, the best thing, they put their best foot forward, because this is the prospective students. We want to impress them so that they will come and be part of our school. So we would do that every year. It would come around, and then this one day in 1998, we're doing this, and our turn gets up. It's our turn to get up, so we get up and we start doing a different song. This one was called Who Can Satisfy, and it was a choir song that was popular in the late 90s, and most people don't know it as that. They know it as the There Is a Fountain song. So the song modulates, and every time they would take it up, more people would stand up and shout, and there is a fountain, woo! So what happens is we go through and we are singing this song, and we come to the end of the song. The director, Dr. Horton, had brought us in a couple of times after the song, and we repeated it. And there was an atmosphere of worship that was taking place in that room. 2,000 plus people in that room. And in that moment, they weren't as concerned about what was going on with the next group or really what was going on around them. There was just a moment of flat-out worship. And that's something that Dr. Horton would tell us, flat-out worship. You need to just not be concerned with what else is going on. Just worship flat out. And people were so engaged in worship, their hands were raised in surrender to God. They were allowing His presence to fill the room. There was so much worship that was taking place. But the announcer got on the sound system and said, because it was time for the next group to come on stage, "Ladies and gentlemen, campus choir." Thank you, campus choir. And she was off stage. Nobody could see her, but she was just doing what she was supposed to do. Announce the next group to come out. And my director wasn't having any of it. "Ladies and gentlemen, campus choir." "Thank you, campus choir." And Dr. Horton looked over at the band and counted them off, and boom, there is a fountain. Whoa! Everybody went nuts. And if we thought they had gone nuts in worship before, it was at that moment that it just broke loose. There was a guy, he was much smaller than me, but at the time he ran out of the choir. He got down on the floor. Now this is some crazy stuff here. I'm telling you, if it happened in Pentecostal churches during this period of my life, I saw it happen. This guy got out, and some of you might be familiar with the worm, the dance, the worm. mean, he jumped out and laid on his belly and did this worm dance all across the front of the stage. Another guy, another pastor friend of mine, he's a pastor now, he wasn't then, he took off running off the front of the stage. If you've ever been in this auditorium, the stage is 5 feet high at the very front of it. So he goes, and it's a real steep incline. So he goes just off the front of the stage, just like $1 Million Man. And he hit the incline and slipped and hit his face on the carpet. But there was a lot of just exuberant praise going on. And if you're watching this online right now, Buck, I love you, buddy, but you know what I'm talking about. But there was a lot of dancing and running and foolishness and that kind of thing that was happening. The crowd was no longer interested in the show at that point. We were just in a mindset of worship, including me. I wasn't concerned with everything going on in that moment anymore. I was in my own little worship world, and that was new for me. Because where I was brought up, I was kind of on the outside of that. I would see people be blessed and be moved in the Spirit, and there were times when I would sit back and go, man, I wish God would move on me like that, but he just hasn't chosen to. But more often than not, it was, man, I hope God doesn't move on me like that, because I was crushing on some girl, and I didn't want her to think I was one of them crazy people, like we go get snakes out and do weird stuff, start drinking poison. No, we don't do that. But I didn't want to partake in all that extra worship. It was just extra. I'm good over here. Let me have my Jesus the way I want it. Y'all can have all the extra. But in that moment, that night, I let loose. And I didn't do the worm on the front of the stage, much to the delight of everybody. It would have been terrible. But it wasn't for them anyway. My worship in that moment was between me and God. And something broke loose within me that night. And I jumped, and I danced, and I sang. And I can tell, there's some of you in the room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, there's some of you in the room that know exactly what I'm talking about because you were at Lee during that time when that was what happened. And then there's some of you that you're like, oh no, here we go. Where's the exit? If they start doing that, that's not my thing. I need to slip out. But during this time, God was really challenging what my sense of what was cool and what was, and I wasn't ever really what you would consider cool, but what I considered to be normal and my self-consciousness there. God helped me see that being obedient to him and worrying about what some girl would think, those are two things that could not exist in the same space for very long. I could choose to care what some girl thought, or I could choose to seek after what God wanted. And I learned so much during that time about being uninhibited in the presence of God. So we're going to be in 2 Samuel, this day. Today's text is out of 2 Samuel, and we're going to see where David was uninhibited, where David danced before the Lord. And see, I was wearing a suit and tie back then, and it's hard to tell because it's not a good picture, but we're wearing suit and tie, and the ladies were wearing dresses. David danced in considerably less than a suit and tie in 2 Samuel there. But what I want to do is look at this story that comes right before the story of David dancing out of his robes, because I want to set up what's happening. I want us to understand why certain things happen a certain way. Last week we saw David was anointed as king. We saw that he was anointed first king over Judah, then he was anointed as king over the rest of the nation, and David had come to the fulfillment of his calling as king. Now, they're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to the city. The Philistines had the Ark for a while, and it's time to bring that back. The Ark represented the presence of God. When they would go into battle, they would carry the Ark before the army, and they would win the battle because God's presence was with them. The Ark, the way they would carry the Ark is that they would go, and when they went to cross the Jordan River, as they began to walk towards the river, as the priests would place their foot on the bank of the river carrying the Ark, it would part and they would walk across on dry land. The Ark represented the presence of God. So they've got this big ceremony planned. There's this parade. There's this celebration. They are bringing the presence of God back to the capital city. They are ushering in the presence of God back to where he's supposed to be, in this place of prominence. 2 Samuel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. Now, the way the ark was set up, there was the way this piece of furniture was built, the lid sat on top of the ark. There were two angels that had their wings that would cover their faces. In between those angels was what was called the mercy seat. That's where the presence of God would reside. In the tabernacle in the Old Testament, in the wilderness days, they would bring the ark and set it, and they would begin to build the temple around the ark, and that where the ark was the Holy of Holies. That was the place that when God's presence filled the temple, or filled the tabernacle, the people would look, and this giant tent, this place of meeting, would look like it was breathing because the presence of God was so strong. So that's what they're talking about here when they're bringing this back to the capital city. What verse was I at? I got myself. All right, verse 3. So they set the ark on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. Then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord, on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand. I want to stop there for just a second, because that's kind of very important here. They're putting it on the ark. They're putting the ark on a cart. And when Uzzah put out his hand to take hold of the ark, he touched the ark because the oxen stumbled. Verse 7, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. Now, keep in mind, they're carrying in the Ark of the Covenant. There was a long tradition of how the Ark was supposed to be carried. There were instructions that were given to the people of Israel long ago when the Ark was built, how to carry it. It was supposed to be on poles. The priests would carry the poles and would hold the poles and carry the Ark this specific way, so that there would be no way that something like this could happen. But the ark had been in the camp of the Philistines for a while. And we know by reading about what happened during that time, when they put the ark in their temple, they came in the next day, and this statue of their gods, the Philistine god, was laid down in front of the ark of God. So they stood it back up. They come back in the next morning. Not only is that statue then laid in front of the ark, it's broken at that point. So the Philistines knew there was something going on with this thing. It was special. It was something significant about the presence of God. They knew that it meant something to the Israelites, is why they captured it, and they wanted it to work for them, but it wasn't that. That's not how it worked. So they devised this cart that you could place it on. So the children of Israel knew the right way to transport the ark. This Philistine innovation here is this cart that they are trying this different way, and it seemed like an efficient way. It seems to be a pretty good thing. Let's put it on the cart so the priests don't get tired, so the priests can do some more worship, and we can do all this. This is great. But it gives us a glimpse of why this is problematic. You see, Uzzah is one of the men who's placed in charge of the ark. Uzzah has good intentions. Uzzah doesn't want the ark to fall to the ground. He's not doing anything that is in his heart of hearts. He's not trying to disrespect God. He doesn't want the ark to fall. But the root problem here is that Uzzah, who is a religious figure here, he steps beyond his authority and tries to manage something that was holy and was not his to manage in the first place. Uzzah is trying to control something that he is not meant to control. Eugene Peterson, author, says this of the story: it's fatal to take charge of God. Uzzah is the person who has God in a box and officially assumes responsibility of keeping him safe from the mud and dust of the world. Men and women who take it upon themselves to protect God from the vulgarity of sinners and ignorance of commoners keep showing up in religious precincts. It's dangerous when we become so familiar with the things of God that we think we understand him and that we can begin to utilize that to control him. Uzzah's actions here show us that he thought he was the one who needed to protect God. I've got to protect the presence of God here. If the ark falls, which it shouldn't have been on the cart to begin with, and I'm sure as it began to be unstable, Uzzah realized, oh, maybe we should have carried this like we were told to. And he reaches out and tries to steady it, but in that moment, he doesn't get another thought. But he has this moment here where he thinks he's the one who needs to protect God from the dirt, from the mud. If the ark falls and the ark breaks, then what will the people think? We won't be able to win in battle anymore. The people won't rally around. We won't have the presence of God because this piece of furniture is going to break. He's more concerned about the piece of furniture than he was about what it represented. The reality is that God was the one who was keeping the people safe, not the ark. The ark wasn't keeping the people safe. That God was the one behind the ark. He was the presence that the ark represented. God didn't need Uzzah to keep him safe. He makes the mistake that religious people tend to make, and that is that they try to domesticate that which cannot be domesticated. They try to control that which cannot be controlled. And in that moment, God strikes him dead. And David gets mad at God about it. David gets mad. Again, it said, David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. We see this in David throughout the Psalms where he gets mad at God from time to time. In fact, there are times when he accuses God of allowing these trials or putting him through the difficult things that he was going through. David speaks to God in a way that many people would consider reckless. No, you're not supposed to talk to God like that. No. You cannot be disrespectful towards God. He'll strike you dead. Yet, he didn't strike David dead for being angry. He did strike Uzzah dead for attempting to control his presence. Shouldn't God be mad, more angry at David for his anger towards him than Uzzah for the good intentions that he had? He was just trying to keep the ark safe. He was just trying to keep this wonderful thing, this beautiful, this very presence of God, a piece of furniture from falling. But God never responds out of anger toward David's anger. God clearly loves David, but I would go so far as to say that it appears that God likes this about David. God likes that David is pushing back here. You have the Uzzahs of the world that try to control and try to keep everything managed. This is how it's supposed to be. This goes here, and it has to look like this. But then you have the Davids of the world who throw caution to the wind when worshiping him and when talking to him. And that's something that makes people nervous. So of course, at this point, the celebration stops. They end up, we're not bringing the ark back into the city right now. They keep it where it is. It actually stays at a guy's house for a while. And while it's at his house, his family is blessed. And some time passes, and then it starts all over again. And we can go down to verse 14 to see when this begins. David's like, all right, time to bring the ark home. We're going to do it right this time. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, with the sound of the trumpet. Now as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So they brought the ark of the Lord, and they set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Then he distributed among all the multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. Then David returned to bless his household. I'm going to put a pin. I'm going to come back to that verse in just a second. Then David went to bless all his household. Now, we're going to get a glimpse here on how domestic disputes work. Michal is thinking all of these things about David's public behavior. It said that she went and she saw him through the window. He was dancing in a linen ephod. Now, to understand what that is, kings wore robes and kings wore undergarments. Now, undergarments then were different than what we wear. I've heard it talked about David dancing naked. He didn't dance naked. There's scripture right there. He was wearing a linen ephod. They said he danced in his underwear, and that's something similar to what we have, but it's not like David was out there in his tighty-whities doing the Carlton, you know. No. It was a linen ephod. It was a garment that was something that was he would wear around the house, but not something that a king would ever be seen in public. So Michal, the daughter of Saul, who David married because he had defeated Goliath. Saul promised that whoever defeated Goliath could marry his daughter. Okay, this was the fulfillment of that. We're seeing this years later. She looks out and sees David dancing in this garment and is embarrassed by him. And she has hatred toward him. She despised him in her heart, is what it says. So, verse 20 again. I want you to pay attention right quick. David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." That's sarcasm. There is sarcasm in the Bible. Oh, look how great you were today, dancing in front of all these maidservants like an idiot. So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord, who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord." Okay. You'd better be anointed of God to bring up the in-laws. You know what? I was dancing before God. Who chose me instead of your daddy who messed it all up and all his descendants? What? How about that? How about that? Ooh, David would be sleeping on the couch. No, because David was anointed, and that's what was happening here. And he goes on, he said, "You think I was embarrassing before? You think the fact that I danced in my linen ephod was embarrassing? Now that you're nagging me about this, you ain't seen nothing yet." Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Verse 22. "And I will be even more undignified than this, and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor." Therefore, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Some of your Bibles may say, "I will be yet more foolish while I praise my God." I will be even more undignified than this. You think that was nuts? You ain't seen nothing yet. And I don't think that that's a mistake, or that not that it's a mistake, but that it's a stretch to connect that David was operating in joy, which is a fruit of the Spirit, and from that moment on, Michal was no longer fruitful in her womb. I'll make myself look like an idiot even by my own standards, and you know what? The people are going to love me for it. I'm going to be an idiot and praise God, and those that you're worried about what they think, they're just going to like me even more. Everything that we saw wrong with Uzzah, we now see in Michal. She's trying to control that which cannot be controlled. David, you've gone too far. You're making a fool out of yourself. The point of this story is not the dancing that David did. The point is so much bigger. What this is showing us is how David lives his life this way. David isn't cautious. David's not worrying about what other people are thinking. He is always comfortable in his own skin, being real before God. And in case you hadn't picked up on this, going all the way back weeks ago when I first started talking about David the Great, that's the overarching theme of all of this, that through these different aspects of our lives, we need to not be so worried about what other people are thinking. We need to worship God uninhibited. We need to not have fear of what may or may not happen. We need to be able to face the giant and be able to go with what God has told us, the gifts that God has given us, the talents, all of this, regardless of what other people think, not putting on Saul's armor. That's been the theme through all of this entire series. David did not care what other people expected of him, what other people wanted. That was Saul. Saul was the one who said, ooh, I'm not so sure about this. Saul was the one who God said, take care of everything, get rid of it all. And he kept back some of the sacrifices, and God sent Samuel, was like, what are you doing here, Saul? God told you to kill all the livestock. And he's like, well, I wanted to save that, for sacrifice for God. Saul was trying to manipulate and control God. No, I know God told me this, but this is good too, right? No. David lives his whole life naked and unashamed before God. David realized God cannot be domesticated. So when he engages God, he isn't concerned with what other people are thinking. And God knew that David would never try to manage him. David's never tried to manipulate God in that way. He would say some things that many people would consider dangerous to say to the God of the universe. You better not talk to God that way or you'll get struck dead. You ever been around that? Somebody say something and you just kind of step out of the way so the lightning doesn't hit you too? Now, understand, this doesn't excuse the wrong things that David had done and would do even after this point. Whenever David makes wrong choices, there are consequences. The consequences aren't because God won't forgive him, but because David is reaping what he sowed. But here's a guy who doesn't care what others think. He doesn't care about his reputation. He's exposed before the Lord, and he's holding nothing back. Back in my time in college, that choir director, whose name happened to be David, he reminds me so much of King David. Someone who was raw, someone who was real, someone who was not concerned with what others thought, especially when it came to worship. But he wasn't always that way. He was very straight-laced for a long time. His father was a former general overseer of the Church of God, which, if you're not familiar with it, that meant he was the cat daddy in the denomination. He was the head honcho. Very, very strict, and he always wore, I'm talking about David now. David always wore a tie, always wore, very, very straight-laced. And then God began to deal with him about worship, and I began to see a lot of this come out in him during that time when I was there. And we began to worship more and more flat out, not caring, not bowing to the pressure to conform and what other people thought. There were times when we did not get invited to certain places to minister because he refused to wear a tie. He said, it's not about the tie, it's about my worship. And if the fact that I wear a tie or don't wear a tie is something that hinders you from entering into where God is taking you, then that's something you need to get worked out with God. But I saw in Dr. Horton a true David-like heart and spirit. He was always going to be real before God. He didn't bow to the pressure to conform to what others said he should be. And because of his leadership, hundreds, if not thousands, came to that college to be part of that group or to be part of what God was doing because of his spirit moving. In fact, he died probably 13 years ago or so, 12 years ago. And what happened, he was on a trip. He was in Jamaica, I believe it was, with the group, walking down the sidewalk, had a massive heart attack and died. God called him home while he was doing what he loved, ministering around the world, spreading the gospel. You may know someone like that. Someone who will abandon everything for the Lord. A person who's not worried about what the world thinks about them. From time to time, from the time that we're young, we learn how to manage our image. We learn how to kind of control our behavior. what people think about us. We learn what's good, what's bad, how you behave in public, how you don't. And if you had a mom and dad like mine, you learned how to behave in public real quick. Or you'd get, there's times my mom would say, I'm going to pinch a hunk out of you. And she would too. I did not embarrass my mama in public. But because of that, we learned how to be conscious of what other people thought about us. I'm at the point in my life where I want to be like that kid back in college again. I want to go back even further. There was a jungle gym, and I've told this story before, especially if you've been in our class on Wednesday night. I just told it this past week. It was a jungle gym at the elementary school that I attended, and it was kind of like a rocket. It wasn't as much like a rocket as my imagination made it like a rocket. But I was a space nerd. I liked the space shuttle program and the Apollo rocket program, all the way, Gemini and Mercury. My favorite movie, as an 8-year-old kid, my favorite movie was The Right Stuff. Most people fall asleep. It's a movie that back then had an intermission, but it was my favorite movie. So I would go out and I would pretend like I was in the rocket. And I would lay down inside this jungle gym, and I would pretend I was on the space shuttle, and we were going to go into orbit, and I would recite the dialogue back and forth from mission control, and we lift off. We have Atlantis, your go for SRB SEP. SRB SEP, go. What does all that mean? Solid rocket booster separation. And I would go through the whole thing. I actually got to go to the Space Center a couple weeks ago and was just as big a kid then as I was back in the day. And actually that reminded me of those times. And I bring all that up because I say, in those moments when I was alone, it was me and God. There were other kids, and there were times when I would go play football or go play something else with what the other kids were doing. But there were times when I just wanted to be alone and just in that moment. And what I didn't realize at the time is I was alone with God in those moments. That those times when he was connecting with me in a deeply spiritual way. What was spiritual about the reciting of the dialogue of the space shuttle? Absolutely nothing. But there was a moment where I was happy, I was fulfilled, and God was with me in that time. Because back in the Jewish culture, there was no separation between your spiritual life and your everyday life. It wasn't, you didn't compartmentalize things. Everything was spiritual. So when you were in your place with God, he was with you. I want to go back and be that little kid again. And I've looked at pictures of myself, and I've wondered why my parents let me leave the house looking like I did. But honestly, I wish there were times that I could go back to that kind of innocence. That's why Jesus said we got to be like a child. We have to get ourselves to the point where we don't care. I was just a boy on a jungle gym. Me and God had a connection like no other. How can I be like that kid in the jungle gym again? How can I be like that guy back in college? How can I be like David? There have been things that since that day, since that moment at Lee Day in 1998, I got out of college, got away from that atmosphere, was told how I'm supposed to behave, how I'm supposed to dress, how I'm supposed to all that. And there's a part of me that for many years forgot what that was. And I have to go back and connect with that guy again. I have to go back and let my heart cry out to God the way my heart cried out to God. I'm convinced that when we let our guard down and we're doing what we love, even if it's not thinking about anything inherently spiritual, that's when God is present, when we are exposed before God. You might be into gardening, and if you're out in the garden and you're just picking weeds, or maybe you've got some tomatoes and it's time for the tomatoes to be picked. In those moments, you can connect with God. When you're doing what you love and you're stripped away from the expectations of other people. Maybe you're working on cars. It's something that you've been doing for a long time, and you're in there and you're just cranking away at your wrench, and you are ready to see the fulfillment of all the hard work that you've done, but there's a sense of fulfillment that keeps bringing you back to it because it's you and God in that moment together. There's something about being unguarded in that way that invites the presence of the Lord in. And it happens when we are comfortable being who he created us to be. That's who we're supposed to. Does that mean that if I do that I'm going to flop on the floor like a fish out of water? No. No, that's not what it's about. It's about the connection with your heart to God's heart. And that's what's beautiful about David and his worship. No matter how far he strayed from God, he always made his way back. He always found his way back home. So, if the musicians will come, here's how I want to close the service today. I want us to bring everything to God. Maybe you need to take that step out. In just a few minutes, you need to take that step and come down and just lay your heart bare before God and say, I need you to remove all the expectations of other people. I need you to remove everything that I've carried for all of these years. I need you to put me into the place, God, where I can worship you. For some people, it might mean a stretch for you, which means you just have to lift up that hand and surrender. You're not a hand-raising type of person, but maybe if I just reach up, and God is reaching down, and he's grabbing hold of that hand, and he's saying, here you go. I've got something for you, and here it is. This is about worship, but this is about so much more, too. In verse 13 of 2 Samuel 6, it talks about that every 6 steps, they stopped and sacrificed. Every 6 steps, they would stop and sacrifice an ox and a sheep. Every 6 steps, the priests would get a break. They weren't getting tired from carrying the ark all that way, because every 6 steps they were stopping to worship God. David celebrated all the way back home the return of the presence of God to the place where it belonged. That's what I want us to do today. I want us to celebrate the return of God's presence into a dry and a thirsty soul. I want us to celebrate the return, and if that means every step you take down this all the way to the altar, God, I thank you for giving me the breath. Lord, I thank you for giving me the ability to take these steps. Lord, I'm stepping out in faith here because this is uncomfortable. But God, I don't want to care about what other people are thinking about me right now. God, I only want to find what you want for me. I don't want to be so worried about other people who are looking. And every step all the way down, you find yourself in that place. David never had to guard himself when he was with God. If there was something that he didn't like, he'd tell God about it. Uzzah was the kind of person who would have kept his displeasure to himself in order to manage the situation. Oh, well, we can't have that. Oh, we've got to, it's got to look like this. If it starts to get anything out of my expectations here, that's uncomfortable, and that's not what God's about. And we begin to manage something that cannot be managed. When we begin to say, all right, God, it has to fit this parameters, and these are my parameters of what it must look like, we find ourselves in the same position as Uzzah and as Michal. That's embarrassing. David said, you think that's embarrassing? You watch. God never had to worry about that with David. He never had to worry about trying to be managed. That's something I don't like, to be managed and manipulated. I have a pretty good feeler for that when people are trying to handle me and manage me. I don't like that. And if I don't like it, I can't imagine how it must feel to try to manage the supreme, sovereign creator, God himself. Living openly before God is an effective way to invite him to communicate with you. Taking everything else aside, coming into a place where you are comfortable, that's where we get real with God. We take whatever it is that's within us and we lay it bare before the Lord. Now see the king who was a shepherd when the ark of God returned. There was a crowd and a great procession, but David's not concerned. He's dancing, leaping, singing, as if no one else has come, because for him
There's just an audience of one. Stand and worship with me. I will sing when no one listens. I will sing when no one hears. I sing because I know my song will always find God's ears. When it seems I am alone and all is gone, when I have nothing but my song, I will sing when no one listens. I will sing when no one hears. I sing because I know my song will always find God's ears. When it seemed I was alone and all was gone, when I had nothing but my song, He was my audience of one. Face to face, I offer Him my song. When all I had left is just one song. He's my audience of one.
This altar is open this morning for you to come and enter into His presence, to worship Him uninhibited, to worship Him flat out. As we move into this time this morning, I pray that God would just open up the doors of heaven and pour out a blessing in your life that you've not known.